cold steel barrel hovered inches from her temple, illuminated only by the blinding strobe of red and blue police lights. The officer laughed a harsh, mocking sound that echoed into the dark tree line on both sides of the road. A Fed, he sneered, kicking her FBI credentials into the dirt. You. Exactly 120 seconds later, the flashing lights would illuminate a very different scene, and he would be the one on his knees, begging, with federal handcuffs biting into his wrists. Stay with us, because what happened on Route 88 that night was not an accident. It was the end of a very long road that one man had been building toward his entire career without ever knowing it. The rain had stopped about 40 minutes before, but Route 88 still held the smell of it, that clean, mineral bite of wet asphalt mixing with pine resin from the tree line that pressed in close on both sides of the two-lane road, turning the highway into something that felt more like a tunnel than a thoroughfare at this hour. It was 2:07 in the morning, and Harwick Heights was exactly the kind of suburb that did not believe anything bad could happen inside its borders, because the people who lived there had paid a very great deal of money to make that feeling permanent. The houses sat back from the road behind long lawns and iron gates. The gas stations had clean windows. The parks had real equipment. The tax base was extraordinary, and the police department existed in a practical sense to protect the feeling of safety more than the fact of it. Officer Brett Landis understood this perfectly, and he had understood it for 13 years. And in those 13 years, he had made himself indispensable to the understanding. He had been parked behind a dead billboard advertising a real estate firm called Meridian Properties for the last 40 minutes. Engine off, lights off, the cruiser pushed just far enough into the gravel turnout that the road cameras mounted on the utility poles could not catch his plate. He was 41 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that always looked slightly clenched, as though he were perpetually chewing on something that had not yet broken down, and a buzz cut that had grown out unevenly on the left side, which he had not bothered to fix, because nobody whose opinion he valued was looking at his hair. He had been with the Harwick Heights PD for 13 years and had never once been promoted past patrol, and not for the reasons a person might assume. He was not incompetent. He was not lazy. He had accumulated 11 use-of-force complaints in those 13 years and 3 separate racial profiling lawsuits, and every single one of those complaints and lawsuits had been quietly buried by Chief Douglas Warren because Landis was useful in ways that the department could not officially acknowledge and would not officially give up. He had a habit when he was deciding something of slowly rolling his class ring against whatever surface was nearest. A thick gold ring from a lodge he had joined at 22, and in the silence of the cruiser, he rolled it now against the center console, a slow, rhythmic click that was the only sound in the cab besides the faint creak of the cooling engine and the distant sound of something moving in the tree line. The clicking was the sound of a man who believed he was in control of every situation he entered, and who had never yet encountered a situation that taught him otherwise. Landis had a philosophy, though he would not have called it that. He would have called it experience. He believed that certain people drove through Harwick Heights the way trespassers walk through property they do not own. And his job, the way he understood his job at the deepest and most honest level, was to remind them where the lines were. He had said it out loud once in the break room to a rookie who was asking too many questions about why certain stops never produced citations. People who don't belong on these roads know it, Landis had said, rolling the ring against the edge of the table. My job is to remind them. The rookie had looked at his coffee. Landis had smiled. The road was quiet the way it was always quiet at this hour on a Tuesday, and Landis was beginning to consider moving up toward the intersection near the old way station, when headlights appeared in his peripheral vision, moving south to north at exactly 35 miles per hour. Not a mile over, which was the first thing that registered. People who drove the speed limit exactly at 2 in the morning on a deserted road were either very nervous or very careful. In Landis's 13 years of experience, both meant the same thing. He leaned forward slightly, and as the car passed his position, the reflection from a distant streetlight cut briefly across the windshield and showed him the driver. A black woman behind the wheel, both hands visible, a gray hoodie, A car that was clean but unremarkable, a 2019 Ford Taurus. His thumb found the class ring and rolled it once, twice, a slow, deliberate click in the dark. And then he reached for the gear shift. Inside the Taurus, the dashboard clock read 2:08, and Supervisory Special Agent Renata Cole had been awake for 47 hours. She was 38 years old, a 14-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and she held the distinction, which she did not discuss and did not particularly think about, of being the youngest black woman in the history of the Philadelphia field office to lead a joint anti-corruption task force. The distinction did not make her feel proud exactly. It made her feel the weight of everything that had to be true about the institution and the country for that record to have held as long as it had. Tonight was supposed to be the quiet end to 14 months of work. Operation Stone Ledger had been the most complex investigation of her career, a federal probe into a money laundering network deeply embedded inside a cluster of law firms and real estate holding companies in Harwick Heights. A network that had kept itself clean for 9 years by purchasing the cooperation of the local police department at the highest levels. The probe was finished. The warrants were signed. The people who needed to be in handcuffs tonight were either already in them or about to be. All Renata needed to do was drive 8 more minutes north to the safe house. The Kevlar vest under her gray hoodie smelled faintly of the chemical compound used to treat the fabric, a smell she had stopped noticing years ago, but which came back to her tonight because of the exhaustion. The way small things come back to you when your defenses are down. The dashboard clock cast a faint green glow across her hands on the wheel. In the sun visor above her head, tucked into the gap between the visor and the mirror, was a photograph of her mother, taken in a hospital parking lot on the night her mother got the promotion to charge nurse, standing in her scrubs next to a car that looked a lot like this one, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. Renata had placed it there on the first day of Operation Stone Ledger, and had not moved it since. In her right ear, a microscopic, calm earpiece carried the quiet open channel to Agent Marcus Webb, who was running overwatch from a mobile command vehicle parked at a rest stop 3 miles south. Webb was 34, methodical, the best analyst she had ever worked with, and currently eating his 3rd granola bar of the night, which she could hear faintly through the earpiece. She noticed the cruiser's shape in the darkness before its headlights came on. It was parked behind the old Meridian billboard, engine cold enough that there was no heat shimmer, which meant it had been there a while. Not passing through, not responding to a call, just sitting in the dark with the particular stillness of something that was waiting. She had been noticing things like that for 14 years. It was the kind of noticing that became involuntary after enough time in the field. She did not speed up. She did not slow down. She held 35 miles per hour on a road posted at 35, and she placed both hands at the 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel and spread her fingers wide, and she waited to see what the darkness behind that billboard was going to do. The headlights came on. Landis ran the plates through his onboard computer before his cruiser had even fully cleared the billboard, and the system did exactly what it was supposed to do, which was to return a federal restricted code, a small flashing notation that meant the vehicle was registered to a government entity and that its operational details were protected from local law enforcement access to prevent interference with active federal operations. The code had been in use for decades. Every officer with more than 3 years on the job knew what it meant. Landis saw it and decided it was a glitch or a stolen plate using a fake code, or just another excuse that someone had printed off the internet. He decided this in approximately 4 seconds, which was about how long it took him to process the driver's face in the moment the headlights had cut across her windshield. He pulled out onto the asphalt and rode her bumper for a 1/4 mile, with no lights, just the aggressive presence of the cruiser filling her rearview mirror, and then he hit the light bar. In the earpiece, Marcus Webb's voice came in calm and steady. "Boss, we show you stopped on Route 88 northbound, near the old way station. You need me to reach out to the Harwick liaison?" Negative, Renata said, her lips barely moving, the words lost in the sound of the gravel crunching under her tires as she pulled onto the shoulder. "Just a local traffic stop. Keep the channel open, but do not deploy. I do not want to blow the operational footprint if this officer has a scanner on his dash." "Copy that," Webb said. We are listening. She pulled the Taurus to a stop near the old way station, which had been closed for 11 years, and sat dark and overgrown behind a chain-link fence, its windows boarded and its parking lot cracked and full of weeds pushing up through the asphalt. She put the car in park. She rolled down all 4 windows because an approaching officer who could hear and see all 4 corners of a vehicle was a safer approaching officer, and safer officers sometimes made better decisions. She turned on the dome light. She kept her hands at the top of the steering wheel, fingers spread wide and visible. In her side mirror, she watched Landis step out of the cruiser. He did not approach casually. He moved with the particular kind of swagger that is not really confidence, but is a performance of it, a practiced aggression designed to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. His right hand rested on the butt of his holstered Glock from the moment he stepped onto the road, and he walked the full length of her car to come up on the passenger side. A deliberate choice because approaching on the passenger side forced the driver to turn away from him and created a moment of disorientation. He slapped the trunk of the Taurus hard with his open palm as he passed it, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet of the road, loud enough inside the car to startle, which was the point. And then he stepped up to the passenger window and jammed the beam of his maglite directly into Renata's eyes. "License registration and proof of insurance," he said, his voice carrying a hostility that was not reactive but foundational, the way certain voices carry contempt, not because they are responding to something, but because contempt is their default register. "Good evening, officer," Renata said, her voice level and professional, the kind of voice that takes years of specific training to maintain when a blinding flashlight is being held in your eyes by a man with his hand on a gun. "My credentials and identification are in my breast pocket, under my jacket. I am also legally armed and my service weapon is holstered on my right hip. How would you like me to proceed?" The phrase "service weapon" did something to Landis's face that happened faster than he could manage it. His expression did not just change, it cracked like something brittle that had been struck. And the crack ran from professionalism into panic in a way that would have told anyone watching that the panic was manufactured, assembled in real time as a tactical choice, because a frightened officer was an officer with options that a calm officer did not have. He took a massive step back and drew his weapon with a speed that was genuinely frightening, the metal of the holster snapping as the Glock came free, and suddenly Renata was looking down the barrel of a 9mm handgun, at a distance of approximately 3 feet, the muzzle hovering at the level of her temple. "Keep your hands on the wheel," Landis screamed, his voice cracking on the last word. "If you flinch, I will blow your head off." In the earpiece, Webb's voice lost its professional calm immediately. "Boss," he said, his voice tight and fast. "Status, do you need tactical?" "Hold," Renata said, exhaling just enough to be audible. She was not afraid. She had faced down cartel sicarios in Juarez and armed human traffickers in Detroit, and she knew the difference between a predator and a professional. And the man standing outside her window was a predator, but he was also entirely predictable because predators always followed the same sequence when their authority was challenged. And the sequence had a shape she could work with. She stepped out of the car slowly, hands at shoulder height, palms open and facing him, and before her feet were fully on the gravel, Landis lunged forward and slammed his forearm into her back, driving her against the side of the Taurus with enough force that the door panel buckled slightly under the impact, and he kicked her ankles apart and jammed the barrel of the Glock against her spine. He patted her down rough and fast, and when his hand found the hilt of her Glock 22 in the shoulder holster under her jacket, he pulled it free with a grunt that carried genuine satisfaction. The sound of a man who had been expecting to find something and was pleased to have his expectations confirmed, and he set it on the hood of the Taurus with a clatter that echoed briefly into the trees. Carrying a concealed weapon, resisting an officer, failure to comply. Landis said, his voice having recovered its swagger now that she was disarmed and pinned against her own car. "You are looking at a 5-year stretch, sweetheart. Think about that while you still can." "Check my left pocket," Renata said. Her cheek was pressed against the cold metal of the car roof, and her voice was steady, and it did not contain fear, and it did not contain anger, and what it did contain was a certainty so complete it infuriated him more than any resistance could have, because she did not sound like a victim. She sounded like his boss. Angered by the tone, Landis reached into her left jacket pocket and yanked out a leather credential case and flipped it open with one hand while his flashlight illuminated the interior, and what he saw there was a heavy gold shield embossed with the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and next to it, a laminated identification card bearing Renata's photograph, the Department of Justice seal, and the title, Supervisory Special Agent. 1 full second passed, during which Route 88 was completely silent. Then Landis threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud laugh, ugly and barking, and it echoed off the tree line and came back as something even uglier in the returning echo. And he shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he has been told a joke he found genuinely funny. And he looked at the badge and then looked at Renata, and his eyes were full of a malicious amusement that was worse in some specific way than the gun had been. "Oh, this is rich," he said. He turned the credential case over in his hand. "An FBI agent. You." He laughed again, shorter this time, a dismissive bark. "I have seen some fake IDs in my time, but this takes the cake. Where did you buy it? The dark web? Or did you print it at the public library on Lincoln Street?" "Officer Landis," Renata said, turning her head just enough to look at him directly over her shoulder. She had noted his name tag and badge number within the first 30 seconds of the stop. She had already noted the make and model of his weapon, the condition of his boots, the way the body camera on his chest was dark, and had been dark from the first moment she saw him. She had noted all of it, the way she had been trained to note all of it. Because in 14 years, she had learned that the moment you stopped collecting information was the moment you started losing control of a situation. "If you call your dispatch right now and run credential number 887 Bravo 7, they will connect you directly to the regional FBI field office, and they will confirm exactly who I am, and they will also inform you that you are currently committing a federal felony under Title 18, Section 242. "Shut up," Landis said, and the amusement evaporated into a flat, hard anger. He leaned in close enough that she could smell the stale coffee and wintergreen mints on his breath, and he pushed the leather credential case into his own jacket pocket with the casual contempt of a man pocketing something that had been offered to him as a bribe and that he has judged to be worthless. "You are not a federal agent," he said, his voice dropping low. "You are a woman who drives through my town at 2 in the morning with a fake badge and a real gun, and who thought she could bluff her way out of a weapons charge. Now put your hands behind your back." When she did not immediately comply, he grabbed her left wrist and wrenched it behind her back with enough force to send a hot streak of pain through her shoulder, and she heard Marcus Webb in her ear practically shouting now, telling her the teams were 90 seconds out and he was deploying whether she authorized it or not. "Hold," she said again, gritting her teeth against the pain. "Who are you talking to?" Landis demanded, and he grabbed her right arm and the handcuffs came out, and the steel ratcheted tight against her wrists, the sound small and precise and final. "Is your body camera on?" she asked. Landis paused. He looked down at his chest. The small square lens of the Axon body camera was dark. The blinking red record light was absent. He had powered it down before leaving the billboard the same way he had powered it down on at least 6 prior documented occasions, which was not yet something he knew she knew. He leaned close to her ear, and his voice carried a conspiratorial pleasure that was the most honest thing he had said all night. "Must be a malfunction," he said. "Looks like it is just my word against yours out here, Agent. And out here in Harwick Heights, they always believe me." Renata closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. She did not feel fear. She felt a profound and exhausting sadness for every person this man had stood over in the dark before her. And then she opened her eyes and slowly tilted her head toward the road to the south. "You hear that?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. And there was something at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to it that it made Landis frown. "Hear what he said." "That low hum," she said. "It sounds like a V8 engine. Actually, it sounds like about 4 of them." Landis turned his head toward the darkness of Route 88. At first, there was nothing. Just the crickets and the wind through the pine trees. And then he felt it before he heard it. a deep, rhythmic vibration rising through the soles of his boots from the asphalt beneath him. A frequency too low to be a single vehicle, a frequency that belonged to a convoy. The first pair of headlights crested the hill, then the second, then the third and fourth simultaneously. 90 minutes before Renata Cole's Taurus rolled past the Meridian billboard, Officer Brett Landis was in the break room of the Harwick Heights Police Department, sitting with his back to the wall at the table nearest the door, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold and not bothering to reheat it. Deputy Sean Calloway sat across from him, 26 years old, 8 months into the job, a face that had not yet learned to arrange itself into indifference when Landis was talking. Calloway still flinched at the wrong things and laughed too quickly at the right things, and Landis had been working on him the way the department had always worked on its younger officers, which was through proximity and repetition and the slow erosion of the instincts that civilian life had given them. Landis was telling a story about a stop from the previous Thursday. A young man from Philadelphia, 20-something, driving a new Nissan Altima with a paper dealer plate, coming through Harwick Heights at 11:30 at night, on his way, he said, to visit a friend in Crestwood. Landis had pulled him over on a lane change infraction that was at best debatable, and had kept him standing in light rain for 42 minutes while Landis went through the car, door by door, the center console, the trunk, the spare tire well. He found nothing. He wrote no ticket. He sent the young man on his way with a verbal warning. And the look on his face when I finally told him he could go, Landis said, rolling his class ring slowly against the edge of the table, the low, rhythmic click punctuating the silence. That look right there is the whole point, Sean. You want people to understand that this road belongs to certain people and not to others. You do not need to say a single word. You just need them to stand in the rain for 40 minutes while you go through their belongings. The understanding arrives on its own. Calloway's mouth smiled because his mouth knew it was supposed to. His eyes did something slightly different. He looked down at his coffee. Before either of them could say anything else, the break room door opened and Chief Douglas Warren walked through, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who had never needed to rush because things had always arranged themselves to his satisfaction. Warren was 58, heavy-set, in a way that looked deliberate rather than neglected, and he wore a tailored dress shirt and slacks on duty instead of a uniform because he had decided some years ago that the uniform was for people who needed to prove something. The Rolex on his left wrist caught the fluorescent light and threw a small reflection across the ceiling. He paused at the coffee machine, listened to 30 seconds of Landis's story without acknowledging it, and then set his mug on the counter and looked at Landis with the particular flatness of a man communicating something he does not want on record. "Tonight is important," he said. "Holbrook's people have a delivery moving through the county corridor. Route 88 northbound should be clear between 2 and 3. I need it to stay that way. Any vehicle that looks like it does not belong up there at that hour, you handle it before it gets curious." "Understood," Landis said. He was already planning on it. Warren took his coffee and left without responding. Calloway watched the door close behind the chief and then looked at Landis, who was already rolling the class ring against the table again, the slow click filling the break room. "What delivery?" Calloway asked. "None of your business," Landis said. He stood, tossed his cold coffee in the sink, and straightened his uniform. "What I need you to understand, Sean," he said, pausing at the door with the ease of a man who has given this speech many times in many break rooms, is that this department has been here for 60 years, and it will be here for 60 more. And the reason for that is because certain people in this building understand what the town actually needs and are willing to provide it without putting it in writing. That is the job. Everything else is just paperwork." He left. Calloway sat alone in the break room for a long moment, staring at the table where the ring had been clicking. And then he put his jacket on and went out to his cruiser. And he drove. And he did not ask any more questions, because in 8 months on the job, he had already learned that asking questions in Harwick Heights was not something the building rewarded. The 4 vehicles came over the hill in a tight diamond formation, no sirens running, completely dark, until they were close enough that the grills erupted all at once in a blinding, strobing array of red and blue LED lights that turned the rain-damp asphalt into something that looked like the surface of a storm light, fracturing off every puddle and every piece of gravel, and the wet black metal of the police cruiser boxed against the shoulder. They were not slowing down as they came. They were moving at 80 miles an hour, and they held that speed until they were close enough that the brakes hit all 4 vehicles simultaneously, and the sound was a shriek and a roar combined rubber and asphalt, and the mechanical protest of vehicles being stopped faster than vehicles like that were built to be stopped. And the first Suburban drifted slightly on the gravel and angled itself broadside to block Landis's cruiser from moving forward, and the second and third came in from the rear and the side, and the fourth stopped directly in front of Renata's Taurus and sat there with its engine running, filling the road with its presence. Dust and gravel flew up into the strobing light and hung there briefly like a small storm. And before the tires had finished spinning, the doors opened in unison. Federal agents do not move came from 4 directions at once, and then more voices layering on top. Drop your weapon. Hands. Let me see your hands. Do not move. The voices sharp and coordinated, and without any of the escalating emotion that characterizes civilian confrontations. Just the clean, cold authority of people who had done this many times, and were not frightened of it. 12 agents in olive tactical gear moved out of the vehicles in a coordinated sweep. Kevlar vests blazoned with large, yellow FBI block letters, M4 carbines held at the ready, and they formed a tight, armed semicircle around Officer Brett Landis on the shoulder of Route 88, with the precision of people who had rehearsed this specific geometry. Every rifle carried a laser sight. 12 red pinpricks of light found Landis's chest simultaneously and painted a constellation there that moved with his breathing, shifting slightly with each inhale and settling back on each exhale. And the total effect was something that bypassed rational processing and went directly to the animal part of the brain that understood, without needing to calculate it, that the only correct response was absolute stillness. Landis's hand was hovering above his holster. He had moved toward it reflexively when the lights hit, and he had not completed the movement, and now his hand hovered there at hip height, frozen by the arithmetic of 12 simultaneous laser sights. Then came the 3-layer moment. The arrogance drained from his face the way water drains from a vessel with a crack in its base, not all at once, but steadily, and the color went with it, leaving something pale and exposed underneath, and his knees buckled, not completely, not enough to drop him, but enough to be visible. A tremor that ran from his thighs downward, and in the reflexive motion of his hands seeking something to hold on to, the class ring slipped from his right hand and hit the asphalt with a small, precise, metallic ping. And it rolled 2 inches and stopped, and the rolling stopped, and the sound stopped, and the silence that followed was the most complete silence Route 88 had produced all night. In that silence, something moved behind his eyes. He heard his own laugh, the way it had sounded echoing off the tree line when he pulled Renata's badge out of her pocket. He heard himself saying out here in Harwick Heights, "They always believe me," heard the pleasure in his own voice, heard himself pocketing her credentials like they were something he had found in the dirt. He heard the handcuffs ratcheting tight on her wrists, and he felt with a physical specificity he was not prepared for, the echo of that sound now surrounding him from 12 different directions. Then the passenger door of the lead Suburban opened, and Agent Marcus Webb stepped out. No helmet, just a tactical vest over a dress shirt, badge on his belt. And he walked directly past Landis without looking at him, because Landis was not who he was walking toward. He walked to Renata. He pulled a universal key from the chest rig and stepped behind her, and the handcuffs fell from her wrists and hit the asphalt with a sound that landed 2 inches from the class ring. She stood still for a moment. She rolled her shoulders slowly, feeling the depth of the indentations the steel had left in her skin, and she looked down at her wrists, and she did what she always did when a situation had resolved in the way she had built it to resolve. She brushed her sleeves smooth, slowly one and then the other, the way you straighten something that had been temporarily disordered, the way you restore the ordinary dignity of your own appearance after someone has attempted to strip it from you. It was a small gesture, and it lasted approximately 4 seconds, and it contained in those 4 seconds every year of every case she had ever carried. Then she turned around to face Brett Landis. The road between them was lit by a dozen emergency light bars, reflecting off wet gravel, and in that light, Landis looked at the woman he had shoved against a car roof 40 minutes ago, and she looked at him, and she held the look for 3 full seconds, without speaking, without anger, without the triumph he might have been able to dismiss or mock or argue against. What she held was patience. The specific, settled, 14-month patience of someone who had always known exactly how this road was going to end, and had simply waited for him to drive down it. She held out her hand. "My badge," she said. Chief Douglas Warren's Dodge Charger was distinctive even from a quarter-mile out, a particular combination of engine note and tire sound that most of his officers could identify without looking, the way people who spend enough time near power learn to recognize its particular signature. He had driven it hard and pushed it past the federal perimeter barricade as far as it would go before the outer agent waved him down. And then he got out and walked the rest of the way, with the stride of a man who was not accustomed to obstacles between himself and outcomes. He was still in his tailored dress shirt. He had not stopped at the station first. He had gotten the dispatch call on his personal scanner, which he kept on his bedside table because he had been getting the dispatch call on a personal scanner for 28 years, and he had driven directly from his house in the north end of Harwick Heights because he had done so with the certainty of a man who had spent nearly 3 decades managing exactly these kinds of situations, who had buried 11 complaints and 3 lawsuits, who had a long-standing relationship with the county district attorney and 2 state representatives, and who had never, not once in his career, encountered a situation that could not be managed through the right conversation with the right person. He had come tonight to manage. He had come with the implicit confidence of a man arriving at a scene he had always been able to arrange to his satisfaction. And as he pushed through the outer edge of the federal formation with the bluster of someone who expected it to part for him, and as 2 agents stepped to block his path without acknowledging his rank, something inside the certainty began to crack at its edges, because the formation did not part, and the agents did not acknowledge his rank, and the road was not arranged to his satisfaction. And then, from 20 feet away, Renata Cole's voice came through the noise saying his name. "Chief Warren," she said, "you are right on time." He stopped. He looked at her, a woman in a gray hoodie who had just been unhandcuffed and who was standing in the headlights of 4 federal vehicles holding a gold shield, and he took a step forward, and she stepped into the headlights so he could see her clearly, and he waited for something in the picture to rearrange itself into something manageable. It did not rearrange itself. 3 layers moved through Douglas Warren in approximately 5 seconds. His right hand moved involuntarily toward the inside pocket of his jacket, where his personal phone lived, and then stopped because the calculation of who he would call and what calling anyone could accomplish was already failing. Then he looked back through the evening, and he found his own voice in the break room saying, "Holbrook's people have a delivery. Route 88 should be clear. Handle any vehicle that looks like it does not belong." And he understood, looking at the recording equipment visible in the back of Webb's open command vehicle, that those words existed on tape, and that the federal magistrate who had signed the warrant at 11 o'clock had authorized the capture of every word, and that the shape of the thing he had spent 28 years building was as visible to him now as a building on fire. Then Renata held out a folded stack of documents, and he took them. And she waited while he read his own name at the top, and when he looked up, she was already looking at him with an expression that was not anger and not triumph, but something quieter. The expression of someone who has simply been waiting for a specific delivery to arrive at its destination. "That is a federal indictment, Chief," she said, her voice carrying no heat at all, the way a physician describes a diagnosis. "Signed by Judge Raymond Okafor at 11 p.m. tonight. It charges you, Officer Landis, and 14 other members of your department with RICO violations, civil rights abuses under color of law, and conspiracy to facilitate money laundering in connection with the financial network operated by Victor Holbrook." Warren looked at his own name at the top of the document. He tried twice to say something, and each time the sentence did not reach completion, because there was no sentence available that served the purpose he had spent 28 years being able to find sentences for. He looked at Landis, still surrounded by 12 laser sights. Landis was looking back at him with the expression of a man watching the only door out of a burning room close. Douglas Warren had been the door. And Douglas Warren could not open anything tonight. Renata turned back to Landis, and she did what she had been waiting 14 months to do, which was to tell him the full truth. She did it quietly, not for his benefit, for the record. 14 months ago, she began a confidential informant inside the Holbrook network, provided the FBI with documentation that the Harwick Heights Police Department had been functioning for at least 7 years as the enforcement arm of Victor Holbrook's financial operation. Holbrook was not a name most people in Harwick Heights recognized. He did not give interviews. He did not appear at civic events. He operated through a structure of shell companies and real estate holding firms that were deliberately designed to look like the ordinary machinery of a prosperous suburban economy. He ran sports betting and money laundering at a scale that moved approximately $18 million per year through 4 holding companies, 2 of which had addresses in the Harwick Heights commercial district. The police department's role was not to launder the money. The police department's role was to keep the road clean. This meant running off journalists who got too curious about the holding companies. This meant creating hostile encounters for anyone Holbrook flagged as a potential problem. And it meant ensuring that certain corridors at certain hours were free from the kind of attention that required a stationary vehicle or a fixed observation post, because the one thing a mobile delivery cannot survive is an unexpected stop by someone with the authority to look inside a vehicle. Landis had been one of the primary instruments of that road cleaning for the better part of a decade. Not because he was ideologically committed to Holbrook's enterprise. He did not care about Holbrook's enterprise at all. He was committed to the specific pleasure of the authority it gave him and the financial arrangement with Warren, which added approximately $42,000 per year to his income in cash deposited through a series of transactions that the FBI forensic accountants had mapped in full detail, confirmed in full detail, and documented in a report that now existed in 3 separate federal evidence databases. The plate code on Renata's Taurus was not a glitch. It was a trigger. The 2019 Ford Taurus had been selected specifically because it matched every variable in Landis's documented profiling pattern. A clean, unremarkable domestic sedan driven alone at night by a black woman registered to a government entity that his system would flag as restricted. It was designed to look like exactly the kind of vehicle he had spent 13 years pulling over on exactly this road. And it was designed to look that way because the people who built the case against him understood from 14 months of documentation precisely what he would do when he saw it. She had driven past the Meridian billboard at 2:07 in the morning specifically because they knew from pattern analysis of his previous 64 stops on this corridor that he parked at that billboard between 1:45 and 2:30 on weekday nights when no call had been dispatched. The earpiece in her right ear was feeding a live audio stream directly into the recording equipment in Marcus Webb's van, with a backup transmission to the Philadelphia field office server. Every word Landis spoke from the moment he rolled his window down at the billboard was captured in full audio at a fidelity that federal forensic audio analysts had already certified as unimpeachable, including the laugh, including the library comment, including the words, "They always believe me," which he had spoken 3 feet from a live federal microphone while holding a federal agent's credentials in his hand. His body camera, she continued, had been powered down before he left the billboard. The department's own maintenance logs, subpoenaed 6 weeks prior, showed the unit was fully functional at the start of his shift. Deliberately disabling a body camera during a stop was a departmental policy violation, and also, given the context of tonight's operation, an additional federal obstruction charge. Victor Holbrook, she said, was arrested on his private jet at Philadelphia International Airport at 1:40 in the morning, 27 minutes before Landis pulled her over. His arrest had been coordinated to occur before the roadside operation so that Holbrook would have no opportunity to receive a warning, destroy evidence, or contact the network of compromised judges whose names appeared in the financial documents seized from his aircraft. She paused. She looked at Landis, who had been standing very still for the last 4 minutes, his hands zip-tied in front of him. His face, the face of a man watching an enormous building come down in a controlled demolition. The kind of demolition where every charge fires in exactly the right sequence and the structure folds into itself without touching anything nearby. "You thought tonight was a random traffic stop," she said. "You thought you got lucky seeing a black woman alone on a dark road." She shook her head once, slowly. "Operation Stone Ledger has been watching you for 14 months. Every stop, every disabled camera, every envelope. We knew exactly where you parked. We knew what you were waiting for. I was what you were waiting for. I just brought the right paperwork." Agent Webb stepped forward and placed a hand on Landis's arm, and 2 other agents came in from either side, and Brett Landis was walked to the rear of a Federal Suburban and placed inside, and the door closed behind him, and Route 88 was quiet again, and the class ring lay in the gravel where it had fallen, catching a brief reflection of the departing light bars before the road went dark. The Philadelphia FBI field office interrogation room had the specific, airless quality of a space where time had been deliberately removed. No windows, a fluorescent tube that buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold where you could consciously hear it. A metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a door with a lock that engaged from the outside. It was 6 in the morning. Outside the city was beginning its ordinary Tuesday, coffee being made in ordinary kitchens, cars warming up in driveways. The sky going from black to a dark and promising gray. Inside the interrogation room, none of that existed. Brett Landis sat in the chair nearest the wall, slumped in a way that the Brett Landis of 6 hours ago would not have permitted himself. The orange detention jumpsuit was the first thing, the immediate physical statement of what had changed. But it was not just the jumpsuit. It was the absence of the gun, the holster, the badge, the maglite, the cruiser, the darkness, the road. Without those things, the architecture that had made him formidable was gone, and what remained was a middle-aged man with a face that looked older than it had at 2 in the morning, and hands that he kept laced together on the table in front of him, because he did not know where else to put them. He did not look up when the door opened. Renata walked in wearing a tailored black suit, her gold shield on a chain around her neck, and she set a thick manila folder on the table between them with a sound that was not loud, but that made Landis flinch in the way people flinch at sounds that carry information they do not want to receive. "Here is how this works," she said, sitting down across from him, her voice carrying no drama and no heat, just the specific clarity of someone who has done this many times and intends to be efficient about it. "Your union is not coming. Chief Warren is in the cell block next to yours, and he has been there for 4 hours, and he has been talking for 3 of those 4 hours because the federal evidence against him is comprehensive enough that talking is the only option available to him. That does not result in a number he will not survive. Gerald Sutton, the attorney I understand you intended to call, is facing 20 years for wire fraud and tax evasion in connection with the Holbrook financial network. He is not available to you." Landis looked at the table. "Victor Holbrook," she continued, "is in federal custody without bail. The shell company network has been frozen. The property holdings connected to the laundering operation are under asset forfeiture. The network that you have been protecting with your body camera and your badge and your dark stretch of Route 88 for the last 7 years no longer exists as of this morning." She opened the folder and turned it toward him. Inside were surveillance photographs, financial transaction records, stop logs, audio transcripts, body camera maintenance records, and a 30-page summary of the 14 months of federal investigation that had ended in the 42 minutes on Route 88 between 2 and 3 in the morning. He looked at the photographs. He saw himself in them, taken from distances and angles he had not known were possible, and he understood in looking at them that the road he thought he owned had been watched from places he had never considered looking. "I was just doing my job," he said. The words came out smaller than he intended. Renata looked at him steadily. She did not raise her voice. "In 90 days, she said, a federal jury is going to sit in this building, and they are going to listen to you say those words in a recording made on Route 88 at 2:14 in the morning, and then they are going to hear you laugh. And then they are going to hear you say that out here in Harwick Heights, they always believe you. She closed the folder and stood. I want you to think about those words tonight, and about what 12 ordinary American citizens are going to understand when they hear them spoken by a man with a gun pointed at a woman he has handcuffed against her own car. She walked to the door and did not look back. Douglas Warren had spent 28 years building a structure of insulation between himself and consequence, and the structure was comprehensive enough that even after the handcuffs went on, even during the processing, even in the first hour in the cell block, some portion of him had remained convinced that there was a conversation yet to be had, a number to call, a relationship to activate, some mechanism within the apparatus he had spent nearly 3 decades cultivating that would, as it always had, rearrange the situation into something survivable. His attorney arrived at 7:15 in the morning and reviewed the federal discovery file for 1 hour and 20 minutes, while Warren sat across from him in the attorney-client room. When the attorney finished, he set the file on the table between them, and he went quiet for a long moment before he spoke, and the quality of that silence told Warren everything he needed to know before the first word was said. The evidence against him was not circumstantial. It was a blueprint. The FBI had bank records tracing 11 years of payments from the Holbrook network through a shell company operated by Warren's brother-in-law, a man named Gary Pell, who had believed his involvement was sufficiently removed to be deniable. Gary Pell had already been contacted by FBI agents and had already been informed that the charges against him would be significantly reduced if he provided a full accounting, which he had indicated a willingness to do. There were wiretap recordings. There were 7 years of text message chains extracted from a phone Warren believed had been replaced often enough to create gaps. There were meeting logs documenting 11 face-to-face conversations between Warren and Holbrook at a hunting cabin outside Allentown, the back room of a restaurant in King of Prussia, and twice at Holbrook's estate in Chester County. And there was the break room recording Warren's own voice at 12:41 in the morning, giving Landis an instruction that read against the context of everything else in the file, was not the ambiguous directive of a chief who looked the other way, but the specific operational order of a man managing the security apparatus of a criminal network. The only card Warren had was information. He knew names. He knew the names of 2 judges whose signatures appeared on blank warrants found in Holbrook's safe. He knew the name of a county commissioner who had approved road construction contracts serving as the primary vehicle for the money flow. His attorney told him that cooperation would reduce his sentencing exposure. It would not eliminate prosecution. Warren sat with this for a long time. He thought about the Rolex on his wrist, which had been confiscated during processing. He thought about the tailored shirts which he had chosen instead of a uniform because the uniform was for people who needed to prove something. And he understood, now sitting in a room that was not arranged to his satisfaction and could not be rearranged to his satisfaction by any mechanism available to him, exactly what it was he had spent 28 years proving, and to whom, and that the audience for that performance was gone. He wept. Not from remorse, precisely, from the specific grief of a man who had believed himself permanent, discovering at 58 that he was not. 6 weeks after the arrests, as the case was being prepared for trial, Assistant United States Attorney Catherine Pruitt began the process of identifying and interviewing the people who had been caught inside the pattern of Brett Landis's stops on Route 88 over the previous 7 years. This was not a simple process. Most of the people the FBI identified had never filed a report. They had absorbed the stops the way people absorb a recurring unpleasantness that has no apparent remedy. The way you learn to factor in rain when planning a trip, not because you accept the rain as just, but because fighting it has not historically produced an umbrella. Pruitt was 43, methodical, the kind of attorney who understood that federal cases are won not through the single devastating revelation, but through the accumulation of ordinary, specific, undeniable detail. And it was in this spirit that she sat across from Darnell Fry in a conference room at the Philadelphia field office on a Thursday afternoon in late October and asked him to tell her about Route 88. Darnell was 29 years old. a high school physical education teacher who coached varsity soccer in a district north of Harwick Heights, and he had been stopped by Brett Landis 3 times in 14 months on the same stretch of Route 88. The same officer, the same road, the same hour of the night. The first 2 stops were for equipment violations that did not exist, violations that Landis wrote in his stop log but never filed as citations, because citations required documentation that could be reviewed. The third stop, in March of the previous year, had ended with Landis writing a resisting arrest charge against Darnell. Darnell had not resisted anything. He had asked calmly, after the second fruitless search of his vehicle, whether he was being detained or free to go, which is a question any American has the right to ask, and which Landis had apparently experienced as a challenge requiring a formal response. The resisting arrest charge had gone into the system and reached the school district's Human Resources Office 11 days later, which had a policy requiring the suspension of coaching certifications for teachers facing active criminal charges pending resolution. The charge took 11 months to be dismissed with prejudice by a judge who described it in his written ruling as factually unsupported and procedurally deficient. During those 11 months, Darnell had not coached. 3 of his seniors had lost their final season with the coach who had recruited them. When Pruitt asked if he would testify, he said yes before she finished the sentence. "The thing I want people to understand," he told her, leaning forward in the conference room chair, "is that it was not just me. I know a woman who works as a home health aide who quit a job she loved because the stops were happening so often she could not take it anymore. I know a man who moved his family to a different town because his teenage son started having anxiety attacks every time they drove through Harwick Heights. These are not dramatic stories. These are just people who had their ordinary lives made smaller by one man with a badge and a stretch of road." The second witness Pruitt identified was Loretta Sims. Loretta was 54, a home health aide who had driven Route 88 for 3 years, 5 nights a week, to reach the home of an elderly woman named Ruth, in a care arrangement that Loretta had taken on because she had developed a genuine affection for the patient, and because the pay was better than the agency work. She was a compact, composed woman who wore her Sunday clothes to the field office interview, who had brought a notebook with her in which she had written down the dates and approximate times of every stop she remembered, and who sat across from Pruitt with the particular stillness of a person who has been waiting for someone to ask her this question for a very long time. Landis had stopped Loretta 11 times in 36 months. She had counted them. The stops occurred almost exclusively between 11 at night and 2 in the morning, which were the hours she drove home from Ruth's house, and they followed a pattern so consistent that it had eventually changed her behavior in ways she described to Pruitt in the flat, specific language of someone reading from a list she had compiled herself. She had started leaving Ruth's house 20 minutes earlier than necessary to account for the delay. She kept this schedule every night for 3 years, which meant 3 years of leaving a patient who sometimes needed company at the end of the day, 20 minutes early, not because the patient required it, not because Loretta wanted to, but because the road home had a man on it who made her feel like she was doing something wrong by existing on it. She had tried once to file a complaint. She had called the Harwick Heights non-emergency line and described the pattern of stops, and the dispatcher, who she later learned was one of the 14 co-defendants in the federal case, had told her in a tone that made clear that due course was a place where things went and did not return from. She eventually left the job. Not because of a single dramatic incident, because the weight of the 20 minutes early of the stops, of the specific exhaustion of driving a road she had once driven without thinking about it, had added up to something that showed up in her sleep and her appetite, and the tension she carried in her shoulders from the moment she left her driveway to the moment she locked her front door. She missed Ruth. Ruth had died 8 months after Loretta left the job, tended by a series of agency workers who did not know her the way Loretta had. This was not something Loretta held against Landis exactly. It was something she held alongside everything else, one more item on the list of what a stop on a road at midnight can cost a person who has not done anything wrong. When Pruitt asked if she would testify, Loretta was quiet for a moment. "I want the next woman who drives home alone at 2 in the morning to be able to do it without planning for the stop," she said. "If that is what testifying gets, then yes." Pruitt wrote down the words exactly as Loretta said them, because she intended to use them in her closing argument. Victor Holbrook had spent the better part of 9 years making himself invisible inside the ordinary texture of suburban prosperity, and he had done it well enough that most people in Harwick Heights knew his name only from the Holbrook Properties signs that went up on commercial lots and came down as new buildings. He was 61 years old, and he had never been arrested, never been publicly connected to anything criminal, and he had built the financial architecture of his operation with enough complexity that any single piece of it examined in isolation looked like ordinary real estate commerce. The private jet had been his idea of insulation. He had purchased it 9 years ago, not primarily for convenience, but for the specific reason that a private aircraft at a private terminal at Philadelphia International operated outside the routine surveillance infrastructure of commercial aviation, and that an arrest at a private terminal would not produce the particular kind of public visibility that he had spent 9 years engineering his life to avoid. He had been wrong about that. The FBI agents who boarded his jet at 1:40 in the morning came up the air stairs with the calm efficiency of people who had been through the approach twice in rehearsal and who were not expecting resistance, which was correct, because Holbrook did not resist. He was sitting in one of the rear cabin seats with a glass of bourbon and a real estate proposal for a development in Phoenix when the door opened and he looked up at the agents, and he set the bourbon down very carefully on the armrest, the way you set down something fragile when you understand with sudden, complete clarity that it is the last time you will be holding it. His attorney was not on the jet. His attorney was at that same moment being walked out of the downtown law offices of Sutton and Associates by 2 FBI agents, the building's lobby security cameras capturing the scene in its full fluorescent clarity. Holbrook put his hands up without being asked. He looked at the agent nearest to him, a young woman with a Philadelphia field office badge, and he said in the tone of a man who has spent 9 years calculating exits and has just discovered there are none, "I would like to call my attorney." The agent informed him that his attorney was currently unavailable. Holbrook nodded once, slowly. He put his hands behind his back, and he waited for the handcuffs. And they came. And the jet sat on the tarmac at Philadelphia International with its cabin lights on and the boarding door open, and Route 88 was at this same moment being sealed at both ends by federal vehicles, and the network that had run for 9 years through shell companies and gravel shoulders and break room conversations was ending simultaneously from every point at which it had ever touched the world. The night before the trial began, Renata sat at her desk in the Philadelphia field office at 10:30 in the evening with the prior victim statements spread across the surface in front of her, and she read through all of them the way she had read through all of them on the nights before every significant trial in her 14-year career. Not for preparation, because the preparation was done, but because she believed it was important to carry the specific weight of the people the case was about into the room where their cases would be decided. The field office was nearly empty at this hour, a few analysts at desks in the main room, someone running coffee in the small kitchen down the hall. The low sound of a news program from a television no one was watching. The overhead lights had been turned down to the overnight setting, which made the desk lamp the brightest thing in the room. A small circle of light on a surface covered in paper. She paused when she reached Loretta Sims's statement. She read it through twice. She paused on the detail about the 20 minutes the way Loretta had left Ruth's house 20 minutes earlier than necessary for 3 years. The quiet arithmetic of 3 years multiplied by 5 nights per week. The hours that had accumulated in the space between a woman and her front door because a man on a road had made driving home feel like something to be survived rather than something ordinary. She thought about Ruth, who had died while being cared for by agency workers who did not know her the way Loretta had, and she held that specific thought for a moment without trying to fit it into the framework of the case, just letting it sit as the kind of loss that does not appear in any indictment and does not generate a count in any verdict, but is real in the way that things done in the dark to quiet people are real, accumulated and uncounted and heavy. She did not cry. She was not built that way, and she did not think this was a virtue or a failing, just a fact about herself that she had known for most of her adult life. She set Loretta's statement down and picked up her jacket from the back of the chair, and before she put it on, she took the photograph from the sun visor of her car, which she had been carrying in her jacket pocket since the morning after the arrest, and she held it for a moment in the pool of desk light. Her mother in the hospital parking lot in her scrubs, standing next to a car that looked a lot like the Taurus, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. She put the photograph back in her pocket. She turned off the desk lamp. She walked out. The United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania occupied 3 floors of a federal building in central Philadelphia, built in the 1950s to communicate permanence, the kind of building whose marble lobbies and vaulted ceilings and brass fixtures were designed to make the people who entered it understand that they were inside something larger and older and more durable than themselves. The courtroom on the 4th floor, where the United States versus Landis et al. Would be tried, had mahogany walls and recessed lighting, and a federal seal mounted behind the judge's bench that seemed in the way of large institutional symbols to generate its own gravity. The gallery was full. It had been full since 7 in the morning, 2 hours before the proceedings were scheduled to begin, because the story had received national coverage, and because the particular combination of corruption and the specific drama of a woman who turned out to be the federal agent investigating the man who pulled a gun on her had the narrative shape that captures people's attention and holds it. Journalists occupied the first 2 rows. Behind them sat people from Harwick Heights, people who had driven Route 88, people who had attended town halls in the year since the arrests, and who had for a long time known something was wrong without having words for it or standing to name it. Brett Landis sat at the defense table in the beige, slightly ill-fitting suit that was the best available option from the stock maintained by the court for defendants who arrived from federal detention without civilian clothing. He had lost weight. His face was thinner in a way that made him look both older and less certain, as if the padding that had given his features their previous assurance had been quietly removed. The class ring was gone from his right hand. His hands rested flat on the table surface because there was nothing left to roll. Chief Douglas Warren sat at a separate defense table under his cooperation agreement, wearing a dark suit that fit him well, the last vestige of the presentation he had maintained for 28 years. But the presentation was structural now, without content, the way a building can look intact from a certain angle after the interior has been gutted. Judge Raymond Okafor entered, and the courtroom rose. And in the silence that followed, which lasted exactly long enough to communicate that the proceedings were now operating according to his sense of time rather than anyone else's, he looked over the room with the expression of a man who has seen a great deal of what people do to each other when they are given authority, and who has not become numb to it. He looked at the prosecution table. He looked at the defense table. He looked at Landis for exactly 2 seconds, with an expression that contained no judgment and no sympathy, just observation, the way a doctor looks at a patient before the first incision. "Catherine Pruitt," he said, "you may proceed." Darnell Fry walked to the witness stand wearing a sport coat that was dark blue and a tie that was burgundy and that he had borrowed from his father that morning before driving to the courthouse, his father adjusting the knot in the hallway of the house where Darnell had grown up. Not saying anything, just tying the tie the way he had tied it for Darnell's job interviews and his grandfather's funeral, and every occasion that required a presentation of self to a world that was watching. He sat in the witness chair and he looked at the jury, and then he looked at his own hands for a moment, and then he looked back at the jury, and he began. He described the first stop the way you describe something that was ordinary and then became, in retrospect, the first instance of a pattern you did not yet know you were entering. He had been driving home from a faculty meeting that ran late, coming up Route 88, because it was the most direct route. A route he had driven 30 or 40 times by that point without incident. Landis had come up behind him at the county line, and the light bar had come on, and Darnell had pulled over and done everything his parents had spent his entire childhood teaching him to do, because his parents had spent his entire childhood teaching him to do it with the specific purpose of keeping him alive in exactly this kind of encounter. The stop produced nothing. No citation, no warning, no explanation. The second stop, 4 months later, was almost identical. Different night, same road, same officer, same sequence. Landis had sat with him on the shoulder for 22 minutes, looked through the car, found nothing written. Nothing. The third stop in March did not end with permission to go. Darnell described the resisting arrest charge in the flat, specific language of someone who has told a story often enough to have removed the emotion from its telling in the interest of being understood. He had asked whether he was being detained or free to go, calmly the way he had been taught. The charge had been written and had entered the system and had reached the school district 11 days later. He did not coach for 11 months. He described this to the jury not as a tragedy, but as a fact, the way facts accumulate in a life when a single person in a position of authority decides to use that authority as a weapon against one specific person on one specific road. My players lost a year, he said. 3 of my seniors' kids I had recruited, kids I had watched develop over 4 years, lost their last season with their coach. That is not something I can give back to them. The charge was dismissed. The record was cleared. The year was not. He paused. I still drive 12 miles out of my way every morning to avoid Route 88, he said. And he said it the way you say something that surprises even you as you say it. The way you realize in the saying of it that you had not fully understood the extent of what had been done to you until you heard yourself describing its continuing effects in a federal courtroom. Landis's defense attorney tried to reframe the stops as legitimate patrol activity. Darnell looked at him with the patient composure of a man who has already survived the thing and is not frightened by a description of it. Nothing was ever found, he said. Nothing was ever filed. The resisting arrest charge was dismissed with prejudice. The judge used the phrase, factually unsupported. He paused. I understand that officers have discretion in how they conduct stops. What I would ask this jury to consider is what it means when that discretion is applied to the same road, at the same hour, by the same officer, to the same category of driver, with no result other than the understanding communicated very clearly that certain people are not welcome on certain roads. In the first row of the gallery, Loretta Sims had her eyes closed. Her hands were resting in her lap, and her lips were moving slightly, and it was not entirely clear whether she was praying or simply recounting something to herself in the privacy of her own memory. Loretta Sims wore a blue dress with a white collar and the small pearl earrings she had worn to her daughter's high school graduation, and she walked to the witness stand with the unhurried dignity of a woman who has spent 22 years in a profession that requires her to be present with people in their most vulnerable moments, and who has consequently developed a relationship with seriousness that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. She did not look at Brett Landis when she took the stand. She looked at the jury. She described her years on Route 88 in the same way Darnell had described his, not as an escalating series of dramatic confrontations, but as the accumulation of a grinding, specific exhaustion that settled into the routines of an ordinary life and changed their shape from the inside. She drove the road 5 nights a week. She had been stopped 11 times in 36 months by Brett Landis, every stop between 11 at night and 2 in the morning, every stop on the same 3-mile stretch near the old way station. She told the jury about the 20 minutes. She had started leaving Ruth's house 20 minutes earlier than the visit required, she said, because the stops sometimes lasted that long and she needed to be home by a certain hour. She had maintained this practice for the entire 3 years she drove the road, which she told the jury she had calculated at some point during the second year to be approximately 780 extra hours over the course of the job. 780 hours of sitting in Ruth's living room after their visit was complete, watching television or reading while Ruth slept, because the road home had a man on it, and she needed the buffer. She delivered this detail without emphasis, the way you deliver a fact when you are not trying to make the jury feel something, but simply trying to make them understand something. And it landed in the room in the way that the most precise testimony lands, with a weight that needed no assistance. She had tried to file a complaint. She had called the Harwick Heights non-emergency line. The dispatcher had told her in a tone that made clear that due course was a place where things went and did not return from. She had not called back. She eventually left the job she loved. The morning she told Ruth's family she was leaving was a conversation she still thought about. Not because Ruth's family was unkind, but because Loretta could not explain in any language that would make full sense in that living room that she was leaving because of a road and what a man on that road had done to the ordinary act of driving home. Ruth had died 8 months later. Loretta found out from Ruth's daughter, who called on a Tuesday morning. She had been the one who took care of Ruth the way Ruth wanted to be taken care of, and she had not been there. She paused, and the courtroom was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said without decoration. Then she turned and looked at Brett Landis directly for the first time since she had entered the courtroom, and Landis, who had been looking at the table, looked up at the precise moment she turned, because the quality of the silence changed when she turned, and people look at things when silence changes. She looked at him for a moment, without speaking. "I do not want revenge," she said, and she said it directly to him, and also to the jury, holding both simultaneously in the way of a woman who had been carrying something large for a very long time, and had decided in this room to set it down precisely where it belonged. "I do not want him to suffer. What I want is for the next woman who drives home alone at 2 in the morning to be able to take the direct route home." The jurors were not looking at Loretta with pity. They were looking at Brett Landis with the specific, considered contempt of 12 ordinary American citizens who now understood with complete clarity what the word abuse means when it is stripped of its legal language and placed in the context of a woman who left her patient 20 minutes early 5 nights a week for 3 years because a man with a badge had made a road feel like a trap. Catherine Pruitt rose from the prosecution table and walked to the podium with the unhurried pace of someone who is not building toward a dramatic moment, but toward an inevitable one. She told the jury she was going to play them an audio recording, and she told them what the recording was, and she told them when and where it was made, and she told them the specific federal authority under which it had been captured, and she did all of this in the flattest possible language because the recording did not need narration, and she was intelligent enough to know it. She nodded to the technical agent at the audio console. The courtroom speakers carried the sound of a country road at 2 in the morning, the ambient quality of Route 88 in the moments after a car pulled onto a gravel shoulder, the sound of gravel under tires, the sound of an engine settling, and then the sound of a car door opening and footsteps, and the particular creak of a gun belt moving. License registration and proof of insurance. The voice was Landis, and the voice was exactly as the jury had imagined it, and somehow also more ordinary than they had imagined it. The voice of a man performing an authority that had become so habitual it had lost all weight. They heard Renata's response, calm and professional. The contrast between the two voices, immediate and unmistakable. They heard the gun come out. They heard the commands. They heard the sounds of the stop unfold minute by minute. And then they heard Landis open the credential case, and they heard 1 full second of absolute silence, and then they heard him laugh. The laugh filled the courtroom. It was the same laugh that had echoed into the tree line of Route 88 6 months earlier, and in the acoustics of the federal courtroom it had a different quality than it had in the open air. It was enclosed by the room, trapped by the walls and the ceiling, and what the enclosure revealed was its complete and specific ugliness. The laugh of a man who was not surprised by the badge, but contemptuous of it. Contemptuous of the person holding it. Contemptuous of the idea that anything she presented to him could constitute an authority he was required to respect. They heard the manifesto line, the one planted in the early hours of that morning, the one that had never been written down because Landis had never needed to write it down, because he had never believed he would have to defend it. People who don't belong on these roads know it. My job is to remind them. Then they heard the badge dismissed. Then they heard the handcuffs go on. Then they heard the words. Out here in Harwick Heights, they always believe me. Pruitt paused the recording and turned to face the jury. She said nothing. She simply let the silence hold that laugh in the room for 5 full seconds. Let it sit there in the mahogany and the marble and the recessed lighting of a federal courtroom, and let the jury measure the distance between what that laugh meant and what it had cost. Several jurors were looking at Landis. Landis was staring at the table with the expression of a man listening to his own demolition and unable to stop it and unable to look away from it. In the gallery, Darnell Fry exhaled. He had not been aware that he had been holding his breath since the recording began, But he let it go now, a long, slow breath. The kind of breath you take when something that has been sitting in your chest for a year finally finds somewhere to go. Beside him, Loretta Sims sat with her hands folded in her lap. She had heard the laugh, and she had recognized it. And hearing it in this room preserved and played for 12 jurors was not the satisfaction she had imagined it would be. It was something quieter and more permanent than satisfaction. It was the feeling of having been believed, finally, in a room that was built for exactly this purpose, by people who were required to listen. Landis's attorney rose. He argued again that the recording had been improperly obtained. Judge Okafor heard the argument with the patient attention he gave all arguments and denied the motion in 4 words. The warrant is valid. Douglas Warren testified under his cooperation agreement on the 3rd day of the trial, and he did so with the particular manner of a man who has accepted the framework of his defeat without having fully internalized the meaning of it, a man who was telling the truth primarily because it had been demonstrated to him comprehensively and without ambiguity that lying was no longer a viable strategy. He confirmed the financial relationship with Holbrook. He confirmed the dates and general nature of 11 meetings documented by federal surveillance. He named 4 additional officers who had received direct cash payments from the shell company accounts. He confirmed that the instruction he had given Landis in the break room at 12:41 in the morning was connected to information he had received earlier that evening from a contact within the Holbrook operation about the movement of delivery vehicles through the Route 88 corridor. Then Pruitt asked him about the 11 use-of-force complaints against Landis. Warren confirmed that he had been aware of all 11 complaints from the time each was filed. He confirmed that each had been reviewed by his office and closed without action. He confirmed that the closures had been his decisions. Pruitt asked him whether at the time of any of the 11 closures he had had reason to believe that Landis's conduct had been appropriate under departmental policy. Warren was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. Pruitt asked why in that case he had closed the complaints without action. Warren looked at his hands. He had the manner of a man searching for language that would accurately represent a decision without requiring him to say what the decision had actually been. Officer Landis was effective, Warren said finally, at certain aspects of patrol work that the department relied on. Pruitt asked him to specify what those aspects were. The aspects, Warren said, that involved ensuring that certain residents and business owners in the county corridor understood that the department was an active presence and that deviation from established arrangements would be noticed. Pruitt let that sit for a moment. "And when you say established arrangements," she said, "you mean the arrangement between the Harwick Heights Police Department and the financial network operated by Victor Holbrook?" "Yes," Warren said. "So when you closed those 11 complaints, she said the thing you were protecting was not an officer who made mistakes under pressure. The thing you were protecting was a mechanism." Warren looked at the floor. He nodded once. That nod, delivered in a federal courtroom under oath, quietly and without drama, closed the last distance between the man in the witness chair and the word that the indictment used to describe what he had done, and the word was conspiracy. And Douglas Warren had just confirmed it in front of 12 jurors and a packed gallery, and a federal judge who wrote it down on the pad in front of him with a sound that carried its own specific weight in the silence of the room. 2 weeks after the verdict, the courtroom had settled into a different quality of silence than the trial. The outcomes were determined. What remained was the formal public statement of consequence, which is a different thing from the determination of guilt, slower and heavier, more like the closing of a door than the breaking of a lock. The gallery was as full as it had been throughout the trial. Darnell Fry was in the front row in the same sport coat and his father's tie, and next to him for the first time sharing the same row was Loretta Sims, and between them, and slightly to the left, sat 7 other people who had given victim impact statements to Pruitt's office in the months since the arrests. 7 people who had driven Route 88 and whose ordinary lives had been made smaller by the man now sitting at the defense table in a beige suit that still did not fit him well. Judge Okafor entered and the courtroom rose, and he sat, and the courtroom sat. And then he said, "Will the defendant please rise?" And Brett Landis stood. He stood slowly. His legs were steady in the physical sense, but the steadiness had a quality that suggested effort, the steadiness of someone who has decided to stand upright and is maintaining it through decision rather than through the organic confidence that had once made him move through rooms as though the rooms had been arranged for his convenience. The class ring was gone from his right hand, which rested at his side, the fingers slightly curled, holding nothing. Judge Okafor looked at Landis for a moment without speaking. Then he looked down at the sentencing documents. A badge, he said, his voice unhurried, carrying no more heat than a statement of engineering fact, is not a crown. It is a contract. The terms of the contract are simple, and they are old, and they are the same in every jurisdiction in this country, and every officer who puts one on knows them before the first day of their first shift. The terms are that you carry the authority of the public trust, and that authority exists for one purpose, which is the protection of the people who granted it. He paused. You are not a man who made mistakes under pressure, he said. You are a man who built a practice carefully, and over years of using that authority as a private weapon against people you had decided did not belong on a specific road at a specific hour. You hid it behind a disabled body camera. You hid it behind a compliant supervisor. You hid it behind the guarantee that out here in Harwick Heights, they always believe me. He let the phrase sit in the room for a moment, the phrase that had come from Landis's own mouth on Route 88, and that had been sitting in the courtroom speakers and in the memories of 12 jurors for the better part of 3 weeks. What you forgot, Judge Okafor said, is that eventually someone is always listening. He looked at the row where Darnell Fry and Loretta Sims sat. This court has heard the testimony of people whose lives were not destroyed by your conduct, but rerouted, he said, which in some ways is a harder truth to sit with. A teacher who still adds 12 miles to his morning drive. A home health aide who left a patient she loved because you made a road feel like a trap, and she was tired of surviving it. You did not do these things in the heat of a moment. You did them slowly, stop by stop, over years, with the confidence of a man who knew the institution behind him would absorb whatever he did in the dark. That confidence has now been demonstrated to be incorrect. He looked at Landis one final time. On the federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to obstruct justice, tampering with government equipment, and civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242, the court sentences Brett Landis to 22 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Your pension and all associated retirement benefits are forfeited immediately. The forfeited funds will be transferred to a civil rights legal aid fund serving Harwick Heights and the surrounding communities to be administered independently of any law enforcement entity in the county. He turned to the second defense table, Douglas Warren. For your role in directing and sustaining the infrastructure that enabled this conduct over 7 documented years, the court sentences you to 14 years with credit for cooperation, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Your pension is forfeited. You are permanently barred from holding any public office in any jurisdiction in the United States. The gavel came down. Not dramatically, not like a thunderclap. It made the ordinary sound of a wooden surface meeting a wooden block with the weight of a decision behind it. And that ordinary sound was in the silence that followed one of the most complete sounds anyone in that room had ever heard. 2 federal marshals stepped to either side of Landis and turned him from the defense table toward the rear of the courtroom, and he moved in the direction he was guided, and as he passed the gallery he did not look at the front row. Or, if he looked, the looking was brief, and the thing he saw in the faces there was not something he could hold. Renata Cole was in the back of the gallery. She watched Landis pass. She did not move and she did not speak, and when the door in the back wall closed behind him, she picked up her jacket from the seat beside her, put it on, and walked out. USP. Lewisburg sits in a valley in central Pennsylvania, where the hills fold in close enough that on certain winter mornings the fog does not lift until nearly noon, and the buildings, which are old and built of red brick, produce a darkness inside that has nothing to do with the weather outside. Brett Landis had been at Lewisburg for 18 months. His cell was on the 3rd tier of Block C, a narrow concrete space with a slit window through which in the summer a column of light fell for approximately 40 minutes in the late afternoon, before the angle of the sun moved past the building's face. In the mornings at 5:45, the guards walked the tier, their boots hitting the concrete floor in the long corridor with a measured, deliberate rhythm that carried through the walls and reached his bunk before the lights came on. And this was the way his days began. The sound of boots on a corridor. Deliberate. Measured. Announcing presence. He had spent 13 years making that sound. He had walked toward other people's cars making that sound, had understood it as the specific frequency of authority, the sound of a person who was the source of a situation rather than the subject of it. Here the sound came from outside his door and moved toward him and past him and was not made by him and was not under his direction and was not something he could choose to be on the other side of. He lay on the bunk at lights out and he replayed Route 88 the way he had replayed it many times in 18 months. He heard his own laugh. He heard it in the tree line of the road, and he heard it in the courtroom speakers, and he heard it in the silence of Block C at 2 in the morning. And the laugh sounded in memory like something made by a person who had been so certain of the floor beneath his feet that the certainty had become a kind of blindness. He heard himself say, "Out here in Harwick Heights they always believe me," and he heard Judge Okafor say it back to him in that federal courtroom. And every time the sequence played out, it ended at the same place. The moment Renata stepped out from behind the wall of agents and found his eyes, and held them in 3 seconds of absolute silence, and gave him nothing to hold on to. No anger to answer, no triumph to dismiss. Just a patience so complete it had its own kind of permanence. The class ring was in a federal evidence storage facility in Philadelphia. He thought about it sometimes, about the absence of the rolling sound it had made against steering wheels and tabletops for 20 years. The small rhythmic click that had been the sound of himself deciding things. The clicking had stopped. He had not been the one to stop it. He did not sleep well. The new chief of the Harwick Heights Police Department was a woman named Patricia Greer, who had come up through the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office and who had accepted the position on the condition that she would have full authority over personnel decisions without interference from the mayor's office. The conditions were agreed to. The first thing Greer did in her first week was to have a conversation in the main briefing room with every officer currently on the active roster. A conversation that lasted 40 minutes and that covered what the department was for and what it was not for, and what would happen if any officer was found to have misunderstood the difference. No one in the room said anything. Several of them, the ones who had been on the force for more than 5 years, looked at their hands while she talked. One of them was Deputy Sean Calloway. Calloway had kept his badge. He had testified fully in the federal proceedings and was under a strict probationary agreement that required the completion of an independent civil rights certification program and 6 months of supervised patrol with a partner assigned by Greer's office. He drove Route 88 on his night patrols now. 3 weeks into Greer's tenure, he made a legitimate traffic stop on the corridor, a vehicle with a taillight genuinely out. A man in his mid-40s driving home from a late shift. The man handed his documents through the window with hands that were trembling in a way that had nothing to do with guilt, and everything to do with a specific learned response that Route 88 had installed in a great many people over a great many years. Calloway took the documents, and he told the man to take his time, that he was not in trouble, that it was just the taillight. The man looked at him for a long moment before reaching for the glove box. The kind of look that takes the measure of something before deciding whether to trust it. Loretta Sims drove Route 88 for the first time in February, 4 months after the sentencing. She noted the date in the small calendar she kept on her kitchen counter, not because it was dramatic, because it was an ordinary Tuesday night drive home that she had been unable to take for 5 years. And ordinary things, when they have been taken from you, deserve to be marked. The flight out of Philadelphia boarded at 6:10 in the morning, and Renata had a window seat on the left side of the plane, which was her preference, because she liked to watch the city from the air at the hour when the lights of the city and the natural light of the atmosphere were approximately equal in strength. She had a new case file open on the tray table in front of her preliminary documents forwarded from the Chicago field office, concerning a pattern of civil forfeiture activity in a suburban county west of the city that had generated 17 formal complaints in 4 years, all 17 of which had been processed and closed by the same internal review officer without independent audit. She had not opened the file yet. She looked out the window at Philadelphia shrinking below the cloud layer, the grid of streets becoming a pattern, and the pattern becoming simply texture on a surface. And then the clouds came in, and there was just the white above and the pale behind. She thought about Loretta Sims, marking a date in a kitchen calendar because she had been able to drive home. She thought about Darnell Fry in the courtroom saying he still drove 12 miles out of his way every single morning, and the way the saying of it had surprised even him, the way you realize in the saying of something how long it has been true and how quietly it has been shaping the shape of your days, without your ever naming it out loud. She thought about her mother in the hospital parking lot in the photograph, standing next to a car not unlike the Taurus, grinning at whoever was holding the camera, not yet knowing that the world her daughter would spend the next 14 years working in would be shaped the way it was. The photograph was in her jacket pocket, moved there on the morning after the verdict. Closer. She was not finished. The work was not the kind that finished. It was the kind that accumulated case by case, name by name, road by road, until there were enough cases behind you that the counting no longer mattered. And what mattered was the file on the tray table, and the city you were flying toward, and the specific people in that city whose ordinary lives had been made smaller by someone who believed authority was a permission slip for everything. She opened the file. She began to read. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Share this video with someone in your life who believes that no one, no matter how much authority they carry, is ever truly above the law. What would you have done in Renata's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay hopeful, and we will see you in the next story.